Desert doesn't forgive mistakes. It watches. It waits. And when you're weak enough, it takes everything you thought you knew about survival and burns it to ash under a sun that feels like punishment itself. Nalnish learned this truth the morning he found the tracks. He was 17 summers old, though his people didn't count age the way the white men did. They counted scars, hunts, wisdom earned through silence. Nalnish had all three, but what he carried most heavily was hatred. It lived in his chest like a second heartbeat, steady and familiar, passed down from his father, who had passed it down from watching his own village scatter like seeds in a windstorm when the soldiers came. The boy crouched low, fingers tracing the depression in the red dirt. Bootprints, 5, maybe 6 men, moving slow, dragging their feet. The edges of the tracks were soft, which meant they were recent, fresh enough that the morning wind hadn't filled them in yet. Fresh enough that whoever made them was still close. Nalnish's jaw tightened. Soldiers. Had to be. This far into Apache territory, this deep into the sacred hills his grandmother had sung about when he was small enough to believe the world was only made of her voice and firelight. He rose slowly, his body a shadow among shadows, and began to follow. The stories he'd grown up with didn't paint soldiers as men. They were creatures of smoke and cruelty, burning what they couldn't understand, taking what they couldn't earn. His uncle had lost 3 fingers to their ropes. His cousin had disappeared one winter and never came home. The women in his village didn't speak their names aloud anymore, as if silence could protect what little remained. So when Nalnish followed those tracks, he wasn't following people. He was following ghosts that needed to become dust. The sun climbed higher, turning the sky into white heat. Nalnish moved like water over stone, his moccasins barely disturbing the earth. He'd been taught to walk as if the ground were made of prayers, each step an offering to the spirits who watched over hunters. His rifle, old and temperamental, rested against his back. He wouldn't need it. Not yet. First, he would watch, learn their patterns, wait until they slept. Then, he would decide. It took 3 hours before he found them. They were camped in a shallow ravine, sheltered from the wind by red rock walls that looked like ribs against the sky. Nalnish climbed higher, positioning himself on an outcrop where he could see everything without being seen. He settled onto his stomach, the stone still cool from the night, and watched. There were 5 soldiers. No, 6. One was lying down, motionless, covered with a coat that looked too heavy for the season. The others moved slowly, like men underwater. Their uniforms were torn, stained dark with something that could have been dirt or blood or both. None of them looked like the monsters from the stories. They looked tired. One of them, a younger man with hair the color of summer wheat, was trying to start a fire with shaking hands. He kept striking the flint wrong, sparks dying before they could catch. An older soldier, grey threading through his beard, knelt beside him and took the flint gently, showing him the angle, the pressure. There was patience in the gesture, something almost tender. Nalnish frowned. This wasn't what he expected. Then he saw the children, 3 of them, small. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8 summers. They sat in a tight cluster near the failed fire, wrapped in blankets that were threadbare and full of holes. 2 girls and a boy, their faces smudged with dust and something darker. Tear tracks, maybe, or exhaustion so deep it left marks. The children weren't white. Their skin was brown, their hair black and thick, Mexican probably, or maybe mixed. Out here, bloodlines tangled like roots, and nobody asked questions when survival mattered more than heritage. Nalnish watched as one of the soldiers, a thin man with a limp, opened his pack and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Hardtack, probably. The military biscuits that could break teeth if you weren't careful. The soldier broke the biscuit into pieces, his hands careful, deliberate. He gave the largest piece to the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 4. She took it with both hands, staring at it like it was something holy. The soldier smiled. It was brief, barely there, but real. Nalnish's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the story he knew. The story he knew didn't have soldiers breaking their own food into smaller pieces so children could eat. The story he knew didn't have patience or tired smiles, or men who looked like they'd already lost everything that mattered. He stayed there all day, watching. The soldiers didn't do much. Mostly they rested, conserved energy, rationed water from canteens that looked almost empty. The man under the coat never moved. Nalnish understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who'd seen death before, that the man wouldn't move again. But nobody removed the coat. Nobody acknowledged it. As if pretending could delay the truth a little longer. The grey-bearded soldier seemed to be in charge, though he gave no orders. He simply moved with purpose, while the others followed his example. He checked on the children constantly, wiped the smallest girl's face with a damp cloth, helped the boy drink water slowly so he wouldn't get sick, spoke to them in soft tones that didn't carry far enough for Nalnish to hear the words, only the melody of comfort. When the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust, the grey-bearded soldier finally got the fire started. It was small, barely enough to warm hands, let alone cook, but he pulled out a tin pot, added water, and began to boil something. Nalnish couldn't tell what. Maybe nothing. Maybe just hot water to make the children feel like they were being fed properly. The youngest girl started crying, quiet, hiccuping sobs that shook her small frame. The soldier with the limp sat beside her, and after a moment's hesitation lifted her onto his lap. She buried her face in his torn uniform, and he held her there, rocking slightly, his hand gentle on her back. Nalnish looked away. His throat felt tight. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Soldiers were supposed to be the enemy, simple, clear, defined by the things they'd taken, the people they'd hurt, the futures they'd burned. But these men weren't burning anything. They were barely surviving, and they were using what little they had left to keep 3 children alive. The night came fast, the way it always did in the desert. The temperature dropped, and Nalnish watched the soldiers huddle closer to the fire, the children wrapped between them like precious cargo. The grey-bearded soldier took the first watch, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness. Nalnish could have killed him then. 1 shot, maybe 2. The others were exhausted, half asleep already. It would have been easy, but he didn't move. Instead, he lay there on the cold stone, watching a group of broken men try to keep 3 children warm, and felt something inside himself begin to crack. When the moon was high and white, the grey-bearded soldier woke another man for his turn at watch. But before he lay down, he checked on each child one more time, tucked the blankets tighter, whispered something to the oldest girl that made her nod, solemn and serious. Then he went to the man under the coat. He knelt there for a long time, his hand resting on what must have been a shoulder, his head bowed. When he finally stood, his shoulders shook once, brief and violent, before he controlled himself. Nalnish understood. The man under the coat had been a friend, maybe more than that, and the grey-bearded soldier was saying goodbye in the only way men like him knew how. With silence, with dignity, with the weight of things that couldn't be spoken. The second day, everything got worse. Nalnish woke before dawn, his body stiff from sleeping on stone. Below, the camp was stirring slowly. The soldiers moved like old men, joints protesting, faces gaunt. They had no food left. Nalnish could tell by the way they avoided looking at the children, the way they drank water instead of eating, trying to fill the emptiness with something, anything. The grey-bearded soldier and the young one with wheat-colored hair ventured out to hunt. Nalnish watched them disappear into the maze of rocks and gullies, their steps heavy with exhaustion. They were gone for hours. When they returned, they had nothing, not even a lizard. The desert had turned its back on them too. The children were quiet now, too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when hunger stops being pain and starts being numbness. The soldiers tried to distract them. The one with the limp drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, making the children guess what they were. A horse, a bird, a house with smoke coming from the chimney. The oldest girl smiled once, briefly, before the emptiness returned to her eyes. That afternoon, the grey-bearded soldier gathered everyone together. Nalnish couldn't hear the words, but he understood the tone. A decision was being made. The soldier pointed toward the horizon, then at the children, then at his canteen. He was planning something. Maybe a march, maybe a desperate push toward the nearest settlement, however far that might be. But then, the youngest girl collapsed. She simply folded, her small body crumpling like paper in the wind. The soldiers rushed to her, gathering around, blocking Nalnish's view. When they moved, the grey-bearded soldier was holding her, his face carved from stone, and the soldier with the limp was pouring water onto a cloth, pressing it to her forehead. She was still breathing. Nalnish could see her chest rising and falling, rapid and shallow, but she was fading. They all were. Without food, without real shelter, without help, those children wouldn't last another 2 days, and the soldiers knew it. Nalnish watched as the grey-bearded soldier stood, walking away from the group, his hands clenched into fists. He stood at the edge of the ravine, staring out at the endless expanse of red earth and blue sky, and Nalnish saw something in his posture that he recognized. Defeat. Not the defeat of battle, but the defeat of knowing you've done everything possible, and it still wasn't enough. The defeat of watching something precious slip away while you stand helpless, your hands empty, your prayers unanswered. Nalnish looked at his rifle, then at the soldiers, then at the children, and made a choice he couldn't explain. He waited until full dark, until the soldiers were asleep except for the one on watch, who was nodding off despite his best efforts. Then Nalnish moved. He'd tracked a mule deer the previous morning, before he'd found the soldiers. It had been heading toward a water source 2 valleys over. Nalnish had marked the location, planning to return for it later. Now he returned with purpose. The hunt took 3 hours. The deer was old, slow, but still wary. Nalnish moved like a ghost, his breathing synchronized with the wind, his heartbeat steady. When he finally took the shot, it was clean, merciful. The deer fell without suffering, and Nalnish whispered the old prayer his grandmother had taught him, thanking the animal for its sacrifice, asking forgiveness for the life taken. He butchered the deer quickly, expertly, taking the best cuts. The meat was still warm, blood dark and rich. He wrapped it in the hide, hefting the weight onto his back, and began the journey back toward the ravine. By the time he arrived, the moon was setting. He approached carefully, staying downwind, moving slow. The camp was silent except for the sound of exhausted breathing and the occasional cough from one of the children. Nalnish stopped at the edge of their camp, maybe 30 paces away, close enough to be found, far enough to remain unseen. He unwrapped the meat, laying it out on a flat rock. The liver, the tenderloin, the shoulders, enough to feed 6 adults and 3 children for several days if they were careful. He arranged it deliberately, so it would be obvious this wasn't a scavenged find. This was a gift. Then he melted back into the darkness and climbed to his watching place. Dawn came slowly, painting the world in shades of grey before the colors returned. The soldier on watch stood to stretch, yawning, and that's when he saw it. He froze, stared, then moved quickly to wake the grey-bearded soldier, shaking his shoulder urgently. The older man came awake fast, hand reaching for his rifle, but the younger soldier was pointing, his mouth moving rapidly. They approached the meat together, weapons ready, eyes scanning the rocks. They expected a trap. Nalnish would have done the same, but there was no trap. Just meat, fresh and clean, laid out like an offering. The grey-bearded soldier knelt beside it, his hand hovering over the surface, not quite touching. He looked around slowly, his eyes passing over Nalnish's hiding spot without seeing, and Nalnish held his breath. Then the soldier did something unexpected. He stood, turned to face the hills, and placed his hand over his heart. A gesture of thanks, of respect. He didn't know who had left the gift, but he honored it anyway. The camp came alive with careful energy. They built up the fire, the real fire they'd been conserving wood for, and began to cook. The smell of roasting meat filled the ravine, rich and promising. The children woke to that smell, their eyes widening, disbelief and hope warring on their faces. When the first pieces were ready, the grey-bearded soldier gave them to the children first. Not the scraps, the best cuts, tender and juicy and perfect. The smallest girl, the one who'd collapsed, ate slowly, her eyes never leaving the meat as if afraid it might disappear. Tears ran down her cheeks as she chewed. The soldiers ate after, their own portions smaller, rationed, but they didn't seem to care. They watched the children eat with expressions that Nalnish had seen before, in his own village, on the faces of fathers and uncles and older brothers. Pride, relief, love. Nalnish stayed in his hiding place all day, watching them recover. Watching the color return to the children's faces, watching the soldiers laugh, actual laughter, rough and surprised, as if they'd forgotten how. They didn't waste anything. They cooked what they needed and carefully preserved the rest, wrapping it in cloth, hanging it in shade to dry. They would stretch this gift as far as it could go. That evening, as the sun began to set, the grey-bearded soldier walked to the edge of camp again. He carried a tin cup, steam rising from whatever was inside. Coffee, maybe, or tea made from desert plants. He set it on the same rock where Nalnish had left the meat, then stepped back, a gift for a gift. Nalnish waited until full dark, until the soldier had returned to the fire and the watch had changed. Then he descended silently, approaching the rock. The cup was still warm. He lifted it, smelling the contents. Coffee. Real coffee, dark and bitter and precious. The soldiers had used some of their own rations, something they desperately needed themselves, to offer thanks. Nalnish drank it slowly, the warmth spreading through his chest, and felt that crack inside himself widen into something he couldn't name. The next morning, Nalnish made himself visible, not suddenly, not threatening. He simply stood on an outcrop where they could see him, his rifle slung across his back, his hands empty and open. He was far enough that he could run if needed, close enough that his presence was unmistakable. The soldier on watch saw him first. Nalnish watched the man's body go rigid, watched him reach for his weapon, watched him hesitate. Then the soldier called out, low and urgent, and the others emerged from sleep with the speed of men accustomed to danger. They formed a protective circle around the children, weapons ready, but nobody fired. The grey-bearded soldier stepped forward slightly, his eyes locked on Nalnish, reading him the way hunters read the forest. They stared at each other across the distance. Two men from different worlds, separated by language and history and bloodshed, trying to understand each other without words. Then Nalnish did something his father would have called betrayal. He raised his hand, palm forward, in the universal gesture of peace. And he waited. The grey-bearded soldier looked at his men. Some silent communication passed between them. Then he lowered his rifle and raised his own hand in return. Nalnish descended slowly, each step deliberate and visible. He kept his hands away from his weapons, his movements smooth and non-threatening. The soldiers watched him come, their bodies tense, but they didn't retreat. When Nalnish was close enough to see their faces clearly, close enough to count the days of exhaustion carved into their features, he stopped. The grey-bearded soldier stood perhaps 10 paces away, his hand resting on his holstered pistol, but not drawing it. They looked at each other, really looked, and Nalnish saw what he'd been trying not to see for 3 days. These weren't the monsters from the stories. They were just men, broken, lost, trying desperately to do one good thing before the desert swallowed them whole. The grey-bearded soldier spoke first. His voice was rough, abraded by thirst and smoke and too many years of shouting orders. Nalnish didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Gratitude, question, wariness. Nalnish gestured toward the ravine, then toward the horizon, his hands shaping meaning that transcended language. There was water, 3 valleys over. A day's walk, maybe less if they pushed hard. He could show them the way. The soldier's eyes narrowed, suspicion warring with desperate hope. Why would an Apache help soldiers? What was the trap? But then the smallest girl appeared from behind the soldier's legs, her eyes huge and dark and fixed on Nalnish. She didn't look afraid, just curious. She took a step forward, and the grey-bearded soldier's hand shot out automatically, protective but gentle. Nalnish looked at the girl, at her thin face and the way her dress hung loose on her frame. Had the trust in her eyes that hadn't been completely destroyed by whatever had put her in the care of these desperate men. He thought of his own sister, who'd been about that age when the winter sickness took her. He thought of his grandmother's voice, singing the old songs about kindness being the truest strength. He thought of the coffee, still warm, left on the rock as thanks. And he made his choice. Nalnish pointed to himself. then gestured north. He would lead them. The soldier studied him for a long moment, then slowly, carefully nodded. They traveled together for 2 days. It was strange, awkward, a procession of uneasy allies bound together by necessity and something deeper than words. Nalnish walked ahead, finding the easiest paths, the places where water might gather, the shade that would protect the children from the worst of the sun. The soldiers followed, weapons ready but not aimed, their eyes constantly scanning but no longer seeing Nalnish as the primary threat. The children walked between them, a bridge of innocence that made violence impossible. During rests, they shared what little they had. The soldiers offered hardtack, leather tough but edible. Nalnish found desert plants his people had eaten for generations, showing them which was safe, which could be boiled into something resembling food. They communicated in gestures and expressions, building a vocabulary of survival that needed no translation. On the second evening, as they made camp, the youngest girl approached Nalnish. She held something in her small fist, offering it shyly, a button. Brass and dull with age, probably from one of the soldiers' uniforms. It was worthless, really, just metal and thread. But the way she gave it, with both hands and a hopeful expression, made it precious. Nalnish took it gravely, turning it over in his fingers, then tucked it carefully into the small pouch he wore around his neck. The girl smiled, radiant and brief, before running back to the safety of the grey-bearded soldier's presence. That night, around a fire that felt less like a battlefield line and more like a shared hearth, the soldier with the limp began to sing. It was a song in a language Nalnish didn't know, slow and mournful and beautiful. One by one, the other soldiers joined in, their voices rough but sincere, and the children, even the youngest, hummed along with the melody. Nalnish listened, understanding that music, like hunger and fear and love, belonged to everyone. When they reached the water source on the third day, it was everything Nalnish had promised. A spring-fed pool, clear and cold, hidden in a rocky depression where the desert's thirst couldn't find it. The children ran to it, laughing for the first time since Nalnish had started watching, splashing and drinking and washing away layers of dust and despair. The soldiers filled their canteens, soaked their shirts, let the water run over faces that looked years younger without the grime. The grey-bearded soldier approached Nalnish, and this time there was no wariness in his posture, just respect. He extended his hand in the white man's gesture of friendship. Nalnish hesitated. Taking that hand meant something. It meant acknowledging that the lines he'd been taught, the boundaries between us and them, enemy and ally, were more complicated than he'd believed. But he thought of the meat shared, the coffee left as thanks, the button given with childish hope, the songs sung around a fire that held no judgment. He took the hand. They shook, their grips firm, equal, and something passed between them that neither could name, but both understood. The grey-bearded soldier tried to speak, his voice thick with emotion. He pointed to Nalnish, then to himself, then to the children. Words tumbled out, incomprehensible but earnest. "Thank you. You saved them. You saved us. We won't forget." Nalnish nodded once, then stepped back. He pointed south toward the direction they needed to go to reach the nearest settlement. 2 days, maybe 3. They would make it now. With water, with rest, with the knowledge that they'd survived something that should have killed them. Then he pointed east, toward his own territory, his own people. His path led elsewhere. The soldier understood. He didn't ask Nalnish to stay, didn't offer false promises of friendship or peace between their peoples. The world they lived in didn't allow for such things, but his expression held something that transcended the limitations of their circumstances. Gratitude, respect, recognition of shared humanity. Nalnish turned to leave, but the smallest girl ran to him suddenly, wrapping her arms around his leg with surprising strength. She said something in her language, urgent and sincere, and though he didn't understand the words, he understood everything that mattered. He touched her head gently just once, then carefully detached her arms and stepped back. The grey-bearded soldier lifted her into his arms, holding her close, and Nalnish saw tears on the old soldier's weathered face. Then Nalnish walked away. He didn't look back. Looking back would make it harder to remember why he'd been following those tracks in the first place, harder to reconcile the stories he'd grown up with against the truth he'd witnessed. He climbed into the rocks, finding his way home through paths only his people knew, and felt the weight of the brass button against his chest with every step. When Nalnish finally reached his village, 3 days later, exhausted and sun-scorched and changed in ways he couldn't articulate, his uncle asked him about the hunt. Had he found the soldiers? Had he taken revenge for the things done to their people? Nalnish looked at his uncle, at the scars on his hands where fingers used to be, at the hardness in his eyes that came from losses too numerous to count. He thought about telling the truth, about soldiers who fed children before themselves, about men who sang lullabies in the desert, about a hand extended in friendship across an impossible divide. But he knew his uncle couldn't hear that story. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The wounds were too fresh, too deep, too righteous. So Nalnish simply said he'd lost the trail, that the desert had swallowed them up, that they were gone. His uncle grunted, disappointed but not surprised. The desert took what it wanted. Nalnish went to his grandmother's fire that night. She was old now, her braids more silver than black, her hands gnarled but still strong. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much of the world to be fooled by simple lies. "You carry something heavy," she said in their language. Not a question, an observation. Nalnish was quiet for a long time, watching the flames dance and shift. Then he pulled out the brass button, holding it up so the firelight caught the metal. "A gift," he said quietly, "from someone who was supposed to be an enemy." His grandmother took the button, turning it over in her fingers, reading the story it contained with the wisdom of someone who understood that truth was more complicated than the tales told around fires. "The world is changing," she said finally. "The old stories don't fit the new realities. Your generation will have to write different stories, harder ones, with more questions than answers." She handed the button back, and Nalnish tucked it away carefully. "Did you learn anything?" she asked. Nalnish thought of 3 children eating meat he'd provided, of coffee left in gratitude, of a hand extended across history's blood-stained divide, of a song sung in a language he didn't know but understood completely. "I learned," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "that sometimes the people we're taught to hate are just people, trying to survive, trying to do something good before they die, and that maybe, sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is choose to see them that way." His grandmother nodded, satisfied. "Then you learned something your uncle never will, and that knowledge will hurt you every day for the rest of your life, because now you can't unsee it, can't unhear those children's laughter, can't unfeel that moment when you chose mercy over vengeance." She poked the fire, sending sparks up into the night sky. "But that hurt is how you know you're still human, still capable of growing beyond what was taught, still able to write a new story, even if nobody believes it but you." Nalnish sat with his grandmother until the fire burned low, until the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, until the night's cold drove them both inside. And he carried the brass button close to his heart, a reminder of the time he'd followed tracks expecting to find monsters, and found instead something far more complicated and far more true. Years later, when people would ask him about the war, about the conflicts that shaped his youth, about the soldiers he'd encountered, Nalnish would touch the small pouch around his neck and simply say that he'd learned something important, that the enemy across the battlefield might feed children with his last piece of bread. That hatred was easier than understanding. That survival sometimes meant choosing compassion over revenge. That the strongest warriors were often the ones who walked away from fights they could have won. And that sometimes, in the middle of a desert that wanted them all dead, people from different worlds could share a fire, a song, and a moment of grace that transcended everything, trying to keep them apart. The button remained with him until the day he died, an old man with grandchildren of his own, telling them stories not of battles won or enemies defeated, but of the time he'd saved 3 children by feeding the men who were trying to save them too. And in those stories there were no villains, only people, only choices, only the hard, complicated truth that sometimes the greatest act of courage is recognizing humanity in those you were taught to destroy. If stories like this touch something in you, If these fragile moments of grace in the midst of chaos deserve to be remembered, consider staying with us. Not all history is written in blood. Some of it is written in brass buttons, in coffee shared, in meat left as an offering in the desert dark. And these are the stories that matter most, because they remind us that we're capable of being more than the worst things done in our name.